Yes, welcome back from lunch. And welcome to the plenary panel discussion. We are so fortunate to have 5 distinguished colleagues that have accepted the invitation from the IPC to be part of the panel. Anna and Laura and Maria and Alexander and Jóhann. In a minute, they will be making a short introduction. One thing to their own background and another thing about it with a few statements about how they see the theme of the discussion, namely the interplay between research and teaching practice in mathematics education. So this is also a session where we go straight up on the theme of the conference. We try to discuss it as the theme for the panel debate. Before they will give their introduction, I'll allow you to warm up a bit by basically discussing the same questions that they have had time to prepare their thoughts about. Maybe you've done that in some of the sessions already, maybe you haven't, but this is, at least this is an occasion to do it, if not before. So please join your neighbor and then discuss your own opinion about what are your thoughts on the relationship between research and teaching practice in math education. Do you consider it to be a completely separate dichotomy? Is it just working as it is? It's a fruitful interplay, there's nothing to change? Or is it basically two sides of the same coin? I mean, why distinguish between research and teaching practice? It all ends up the same place? Things like that could be for to consider, but basically just discuss what's your opinion so that you have a background for reflecting on when you hear 5 other opinions about it. All right? So take a 3 to 5 minutes to do that. Okay, please look up again so we can welcome properly our 5 panelists. You all share the fact that you are early career researchers. That's why you've been picked partly. We've realized during our presentation that you also share coming from teaching as occupation to research as occupation at some point in your career. So you have, like we talked about, we couldn't really tell whether you have bridged the gap, but you have at least crossed it. And then you have accepted very easily the acceptance from the IPC, so I think that's a very brave decision to sign up for telling your thoughts to the big audience. So let's welcome them with a big applause for that. And now it's time for us to hear a little more about, as I said, first your background and then your initial thoughts, general thoughts about this relationship between research and practice. You're on first, Anna, please.
Yes, thank you. And during lunch we realized that I'm actually the most youth or least senior of us, because I still have some time to go in my PhD. And my background is that I'm a teacher in math and physics in upper secondary school. I worked for almost 5 years before I entered into my PhD studies at Gothenburg University. And I entered into a quite special research school for teachers. It's interdisciplinary, so we are positioned at the departments of our interest. So I'm at the mathematics department. And I didn't enter into a big project or anything. I could kind of do almost anything I wanted. And so I started with a topic I got from my practice, because I had noticed that some students were had a refined way of solving equations, but when it came to numbers in decimal form and negative numbers, they didn't always do the same thing. And you can see an example here on the board, where it's the same student that solves they have a calculator and they solve these whole number equations, and then even answers like when you have the generalized number A and B, you can say, well, I use division, but then does it do the same thing with the decimal numbers? So that's what I've been looking into, the way they think about the numbers and the equation solving, and I did a licentiate thesis last year about this, and now I went more into teaching and how this can be supported. And so I have one project with 3 teachers doing a learning study which is partly funded by the fund called ULF, who actually is dedicated to supporting collaborations between researchers and teachers. And I also have a project where me and another PhD student we're going to design to address this issue in a digital learning environment. And so I was asked to make 2 statements about the relation between practice and research. And I actually consider it as kind of a relation, also from my experience as a teacher. I think I had some relation to research, more or less close, and also maybe some researchers I thought did good work. So it's a relation, and I think we should build on that relation, build trust. And so my first statement was that the conditions for doing research need to reward collaborations with teachers, and I think my PhD is kind of a proof of that, both because of the research school I entered in that was for PhD students, and also the funding, and we need to make more of those platforms, and not only reward publishing, but like the relevance of the publishing. And my second statement was also I wanted to share something from my PhD experience. And I think we need to use different kind of collaborations, like teacher education, social media, and every opportunity we get. But one opportunity I got was to do this collaboration with the teachers, and we did it digitally. So we met online, and then when we filmed their teaching, I went to them. But the online thing enabled me to meet the teachers that were in other cities that might not get that question very often from researchers. So, and it also limited the time they had to commit. So I think that kind of collaboration could be useful. Thanks.
Thank you, Anna. Now it's on your turn, Laura.
Yes, my name is Laura, and I am an early career researcher, but I've maybe not as early career as a mathematics educator. I graduated as a teacher in 1997, and I for 10 years taught several subjects, primarily music and mathematics for 10 years back in Iceland, where I was born and raised. But in 2007, I moved to Denmark and studied in this house for 2 years and graduated in 2009 and started at Univeristy College, which is where we have the teacher education in Jutland here in Denmark. And so I've been there for 15 years now as a teacher educator. But approximately 10 years ago, I got the opportunity to be involved in the research center and the last years in the program for mathematics education, where I have had several opportunities to work with different projects. But then, approximately 5 years ago, I was lucky that I got the opportunity to contribute to an application with the neighbor university, which have the research, Tryggfondens Research Center for Child Research. And I contributed with an application where they also have a PhD position within that I then could apply. So I could affect the problems and the research I was working on based on my background and my experience. So I started in February 2020 and handed it in January last year and defended in April last year, so 23. And then my research focus has developed through all this process from practice, from my first observation as a mathematics teacher, and then later my cooperation in the research program, where I've been working closely with colleagues, and we have developed interest, and my project is also based and closely related to my colleagues' research. So we have, in that way, we are developing a strong research environment, as I see it, based on our common experience from practice. And what I have been thinking a lot about as an early career researcher, that is some different elements related to cultural aspects in different ways. One, first, from mathematics education, did my PhD and my research in environment with the economists, educational economists and political scientists. And they place a different questions, they have a different interest, they have a different understanding of the questions and the discussions we are having here at this conference, and that has also affected the way of how I have been working. And then again, I am employed, and the second statement, if we call it a statement, I am employed at the teacher education, and there are expectations from the teacher education that I bring something back to my students, to the teacher education and development then, while I'm working in the research. So there is some interplay between my role as a researcher and at the teacher education. And this cultural aspect, that might be something that we will come back to later.
Thank you, Loa. Now it's you, Maria, please.
Yes. Well, 20 years ago, I finished the teacher education as a teacher in math and physics and chemistry and arts and handcraft. And then I've been 10 years in the Danish folkeskole from 1st to 9th grade. And then in 13, 14, there was this reform in the folkeskole, and I was thinking, I'm going to be here for the rest of my life. And then I studied, I thought that I loved mathematics, and I thought that I would like to be a teacher in upper secondary school in the Danish gymnasium. So I applied for a bachelor degree in mathematics at Aalborg University, and I studied that and finished that. And then I was a couple of years in the Danish gymnasium teaching math. But then I realized that mathematics and the core of mathematics for me was also the didactical reflection about mathematics. And I experienced that in the gymnasium there was not that many colleges who had the same way of talking of mathematics and the didactical issues about teaching and the students' reasoning and modeling and like the mathematics. So I realized that the right place for me was in the teacher education. And then I have been here for the Master of Didactic of Mathematics, and since 18 I've been at the teacher education in Aalborg, the northern part of Denmark. And in the first year, I've always had been involved in development projects. So it was about there I realized that it was possible to apply for a PhD stipendiate at the Danish Research Council. So I used a couple of years of designing that project, and it's about STEM education. So I'm a mathematics didactic, but I realized to a meeting that when I heard the acronym STEM for the first time, that in my years back in the secondary school, I've always taught math and physics, chemistry and biology also together. So the STEM acronym for me was very obvious and potential. But when I read into it in the research, I experienced that the acronym was not understood in a certain way. So there was the other researcher I talked to said that there's something here, so maybe you should go and research in STEM, and especially the M in STEM is unclear. So maybe you can research in that. And so the last 3 years, I've been a PhD student. I defended my PhD last month, so I'm a new, really early career researcher. And since January, I've been back at the teacher education in Aalborg, where I teach mathematics, so students come be math teachers, and also doing research. right now it's about half and half, so 50% is teaching and 50% is research. So the statement for me is how is it possible to be a good teacher? I love teaching, I like to prepare the teaching for the students, and I really think that it's important job, because it's very important that we educate good math teachers, but also to be a researcher and be in that environment and go to conferences and make up cooperation and having these projects which I can see myself in. And I also see the workload is different. I work in one way when I'm preparing and teaching, and in another way when I am doing the research. So how can I combine these two personalities, or is it two personalities, or can you say it like that? Yeah.
Thank you, Maria. Alexander, please.
Thank you. My name is Alexander. I'm working at the University of Oslo. So my background in mathematics education research is that I took my teacher education at the University of Oslo, and I did my master's in mathematics education. I then worked as a teacher for a full 2 years, so immense experience, and then I went back to the university to do my PhD at the Lisa Nordic project. So I worked a lot with video studies of classrooms and analyzed those, and I also taught at teacher education for mathematics didactics, and I've been doing some professional development as well. So I will be defending my PhD in September, so I guess I'm in between. And currently I'm working as a researcher and university lecturer as well, so that's my background. So I was asked to do make some statements about it, and I was thinking about, from my experience with working towards schools with teacher candidates and being a teacher myself, I think the problems with sort of the gap between research and sort of practice is sort of based on the relevance being obscured by not sort of having an exchange of ideas between the practice field teaching and the research in a good way, but also that there are very few collaborations still between sort of teachers and researchers. I think it's hard to bridge that gap without that sort of focus in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. And then Jóhann, final one.
Yes, thank you. So my background is shown on this timeline here on the slide. So I actually started my teacher education back in 2011, and now defended my doctoral thesis just last year in January. So as you may see there on the bottom, I actually became a university teacher before I finished my bachelor thesis as an assistant teacher, and was teaching classes at both bachelor and master's level in research methodology and statistics. So my pathway from teacher to researcher kind of came in parallel in some ways. I then, during my master's program, I did 1 year in exchange at the University of Gothenburg in an international master's program in educational research. And from my work there, I also did the master's thesis in 2016 and graduated with a master's in 2017. But during that school year, 2016 to 17, I was also working full-time as a lower secondary teacher, so I have that experience as well. And I have some of my colleagues here from Iceland in the audience today some of them were my teachers in these courses and supervisors. And sort of constructing this introduction, I also had to face the question, when do you become a researcher, really? And the most logical sort of pathway to approach that for me was when I published my first journal article, which was based on my master's thesis. So kind of like Maria, I also sort of became more interested in learning more mathematics and also in relation to computer science, so I finished that as well, so that's also part of my background. But around the same time I finished that, I started my doctoral study. So then moving on to the second part of this problematique between research and practice. So I was in the same project as Alexander here, the LISA Nordic study, part of the Quality in Nordic Teaching project. And my main topic of research was this dimension of teaching quality is called cognitive activation. And I've taken the liberty to, instead of making statements, to make questions, so the audience can sort of reflect on it as well. And the first one about do we care about quality in mathematics teaching? I think you can safely assume that most people in this room would care, but to what extent we sort of agree is dependent upon the meaning of quality itself. How do we see quality and how do we define it? So in my specific study, do we all take cognitive activation to mean the same thing? And if you imagine it having something to do with what tasks students are set to work on, then you have a bit of the story. But if you imagine it also having to do with the way a teacher implements those tasks and interacts with the students about them, then you have an even richer part of the story. But if you, in addition to that, also add how the teacher instructs students to reflect on their own thinking about the tasks, you have maybe grasped the fullest meaning of the term, but gone beyond the scope of my analysis and the frameworks that I used. So just sort of jump-starting our discussion that I know Thomas will be introducing on the next slide on these terms by Schoenfeld. I think the trustworthiness of the research, how much it really echoes the practice, the heart of the teaching practice is quite strong. In a sense, I think what the study may do is serve as sort of an existence proof that Schoenfeld also talks about. To provide this sort of rich qualitative description along with this quantitative overview of magnitude of mathematics lessons in the database. But what I'll mention that maybe creates this tension between research and practice as well is this quantitative representation may sometimes give this sort of illusion of total generality that is worth being mindful of. So I'll put my period there for now.
Thank you very much, all five of you. As you hinted at, Jóhann, we now move on to have a discussion or a debate between the five of you, and we've chosen to structure that in two ways that I'll show you, and then I'll allow you a little time, like in the beginning, to sort of like think with us about the question. The one way of framing it would be to try to relate to, now we're at a research conference, so we try to look at the research practice relation from a research perspective, because we're here as researchers, so we might ask ourselves how can and should and would our research be influenced by considering the relation to teaching practice. And as you mentioned, Jóhann, Alan Schoenfeld has offered us 3 dimensions in which to consider the quality of research in general. It's not related in his writing specifically to research versus practice. One dimension is what he labels importance, and he puts it in a question: why should one care about the research that's being done? And then, of course, he argues that if the question there is, well, no one would care at all, then we shouldn't do the research. I mean, if the value, if you want to put it that way, along that dimension is 0, it shouldn't be done. That's the same thing with the other 2 dimensions. The second one he mentioned, he calls trustworthiness. Why should one believe what the author says? And he gives the same kind of argument that if what you're saying is believed by no one, and there are no background for the claims you make, then it's very doubtful whether we should call it research. I mean, it's fair enough to have claims running around, but one of the things we should require from research, he's arguing, is that we make ourselves trustworthy, one way or the other. So again, if there are no trustworthiness, if we are in a different genre from research, he's arguing. The third dimension that he's suggesting, he calls it generality, and the guiding question is what situations or context does the research really apply to? So that is like, in a way, the width of the research, or the usefulness of the research. And again, if the generality is limited to only the people that were actually involved, maybe only the researcher, then we certainly shouldn't do the research. Research is valuable because we are developing something that has relevance to someone else than just ourselves. So the simple point is that if any of these 3 dimensions ends up with not being present or has the value 0 in a piece of research, we really have a problem. And then, of course, one of the interesting things that is to be considered is it possible to raise once the level along all these 3 dimensions at the same time, or are they contrasting each other sometimes? Is one being raised at the expense of the other, etc., etc.? So that's one way we've chosen to frame our discussion in a minute. The other one is that you could have such discussions in different fora. One is that you can talk about your own research. I mean, that has the advantage that you will have the opportunity to give specific examples. You can go down to your own PhD project and say, I experienced it as so-and-so. And maybe that's the same as your opinion about what you think is or should be the case in math education in general. Maybe not. It might be possible that you experience something in your own research, but it shouldn't be like that, or you don't think that's the way it is in general. You've been fortunate, or you've been very unfortunate, maybe in the framing you had. Another thing to consider is to distinguish between what's it like right now, what was it like in your projects, or how do you see the relation right now in math education? That might not be the same as how you would actually like it to be. Maybe you think there are frauds or unfortunate things going on, and you would like it to be different, and it would be very interesting to hear your opinion about, in a way, your dream picture about if I could decide we should do it this way, as an early career perspective. And again, before the 5 of you will start discussing that, we'll allow you to have a short discussion about it. So if we put the 2 together, you can say from the matrix that how is or should your own research or math education in general research relate to the research practice relationship when it comes to one or more of those 3 dimensions. You can pick your own. Of course, you cannot discuss in all the 4 cells of the matrix and along all the 3 dimensions, but that's just in a way a reflective tool. So again, take some minutes to discuss with your neighbor what would be your perspective here, and how do you consider this framing, right? Then we'll start a discussion short while. Now we'll start the discussion among the panelists, and at least to a starting point, we'll take it 1 dimension at a time. So we'll start with the issue of relevance. So the question to be discussed now among the 5 of you could be stated as, what are your thoughts on the research-practice relationship, especially when it comes to the relevance of the research? Or another more harsh way to put it would be, from my perspective, that I imagine and hope that you find the research that you've been doing in your PhD relevant, to some extent at least. If so, how has that been affected by by your thoughts on the relationship between research and practice, and maybe how that relationship has been played out in your research? So anyone? Yeah, Laura?
Yes, I think it's very interesting because you, doing research, you want to focus what is your main interest. You can choose the topics, and if I should have done that when I starting and forming my PhD, I would have loved to do some intervention or some design-based research, working with teaching, developing students' adaptivity and flexibility, which is my main interest or focus. But at the same time, I had to ask myself, do we need that? Do we need that part of the research now? I did not know, because there was other unanswered questions before. So we have in Denmark this intended curriculum which say, fælles mål, which say that according to developing strategies in arithmetic, you have to base on the number understanding, the student understanding of numbers, but not practicing, for example, standard algorithm. if you look at the implemented curriculum, the books, the textbooks, you can see some indications of, okay, that is the focus. But what is happening in the received curriculum, what is happening in the classroom, that I didn't know. We have some indication from the final examination after grade 9 showing that most of the students have problems, for example, in subtraction and division primarily, and some of the errors, if you analyze them, you can show, okay, it indicates standard algorithm. So I needed before, I would have loved to do some intervention, making practice better, to know more about what is happening in the classroom as they are today. So what had relevance in start was maybe not what I would have loved to start, but what I needed to start because of these differences is what, yeah. So that was
that's a good distinction. Maria, you?
Yes. Yes, when you apply for a PhD stipendium at the Danish Research Council, you have to argue the relevance of the research. And in my case, STEM is, there's a lot of written thing about STEM. This is an international societal ambition, like we want to have more children, young people with STEM competence. And there's also a national ambition, so you can see in different kind of documents that there are this ambition. And then I, as a math teacher and didactical, I try to argue how should math and science contribute to fulfill this ambition. And my PhD is about that. I identified STEM competence, what could that be? And then I worked together with teachers trying to see how could we together development and do teaching, trying to fulfill this STEM competence. But that empirical study is only, like, now it's ended. It was during a whole school year with 3 teachers, but now it has ended. So how can the results or our findings, how can they be implemented in practice, and should they be? So this gap and for whom is it relevant? Because as I experienced as a math teacher and a science and physics and biology teacher in the Danish school back many years ago, when I heard the STEM, I thought, okay, this is great, it has so much potentials, and I think, wow, that's what I've done a lot of times. But when I talk to other math teachers, they do not always agree, so they do not think that, okay, STEM, that's not something for me. I have my math, and that's very important. And of course it is, but how can the STEM agenda be implemented in math education and math teaching in a way so no one feel insecure or feel that it's not for me or it's a waste of time or something?
So if I hear correctly, and actually both of you, there is a relevant distinction between trying to make one's research relevant when you frame it yourself and when you sort of like set up the research. There might be conditions for that is favoring or hindering it. And then another issue is the relevance of the research after it's been done. I mean, the issue of implementation, basically. And those two doesn't have to align at all. Yeah, Alexander?
Yeah, I'll add to that as well, because I was in a project which is a fairly large project within the Nordic countries. So I think the relevance was there because studying and teaching quality is, of course, important, and understanding it in a good way in classrooms. Of course, then my project was a sub-part of that. So there's always, I believe that shows a subject which I found meaning in as a former teacher, which was, for me, goal enactment. But then again, there's, you talk about sort of magnification within video data research, or in research in general, finding pieces that seems relevant and may not be to everyone, you know. So I think, adding to what has been said, I think even though I do believe my research has relevance for the field. It's about how to implement it in the field and in practice, and reaching out to practice in a good way, because we haven't worked together with the teachers as such.
Yeah, Jóhann?
Yeah, so since I was working on the same data set, just to clarify, that's we have video recordings from start to finish of about 160 mathematics lessons across the Nordic countries. So video cameras sort of functioning as a lens, and we were almost looking at it almost like through a window into the lessons themselves. And you could think like, well, how much more relevant can it be? But at the same time, you need to ask the question, how is this relevant for teachers, and how can this be useful for teacher education or working teachers in service? Because what teachers face in their day-to-day life are just decisions in the moment. And that's quite far away from the questions that researchers might be facing when they're looking at video data of those lessons. And sort of how does research address that? And what models do we have in the Nordic countries to sort of these ideals that we have of the aims and objectives of teacher education and the teacher profession? How do we really, like, is it functioning in the way that those ideals are really aiming toward? So, yeah. So one way forward that some researchers are working on are these so-called core practices. And that's still in sort of starting position in some ways, even though it's, but even though it seems really relevant, there are still questions to be answered.
Okay, thank you. Anna?
Yeah, I really like the distinction you made with the relevant before it's made and after, because as you can see, we get the relevance before from different situations. As many of you have been part of like big research projects, I think you get relevance just by joining. But whereas if you start on your own, you really have to find relevance in the teacher's questions and and maybe it's another kind of relevance. But also to the after, like when you have your research, and mine is very specific, how do I get it out to teachers? And that's what I like about this picture, that it doesn't just ask my own research, because it's kind of fun. Should I rate myself high, although it's like confessing to an audience? But that it's also asking for math education in general, because I think we can... my research is just a piece of puzzle, but in a bigger puzzle, it becomes much more valuable. And I get so encouraged if someone says, well, I'll use your article in my teacher education. And also I can say that, well, I read this really good research from some other researcher. And like, I don't have to defend my little piece of puzzle, but like, as a community, I think we are highly relevant. Yeah.
So if we stay with this distinction, and then we could start by focusing on this framing of your research project, for instance, your different PhD projects. Was there anything in the way you feel you've been framed when you designed your research project? I mean, how the community or the funding or the institution you're at or your colleagues or whatever, how you were framed in designing that were lowering or hindering that you could make it as relevant as possible? Or were you allowed, I mean, the relevance it ended up having, was that to its maximum potential, or was there something that was blocking that? I mean, that's in a way you could educate us as a field, because now you have experiences of trying to start up, right? Yeah, Alexander?
I think it's a good point as well. I'll add to what Anna said as well, that being in a large project, you sort of get some relevance sort of presented to you as you start. But then again, you are sort of framed by the way the data was collected. For me, at least, it was collected beforehand. So I used the data which was readily available to me, which meant also that I couldn't actually have a conversation with the teachers. I only had access to the videos of the teachers and the logs that were collected. So, for instance, interviews or anything like that was sort of not possible to use, and also having conversations with the teachers about either what I found or sort of bringing something back directly to them is sort of off the table, so to speak, which I think might be a problem often.
Any other reflections about how you've been framed? Have you had any experiences, some of you, that were not positive? I mean, where you felt, I would have loved to do this because it would have made it more relevant, but I couldn't because... Not really? I mean, yes, yeah, Jóhann?
I can just add briefly to this, like when writing my kappa, for instance, the summary of the PhD project, one sort of suggestion for the discussion chapter was to discuss three different parts: the empirical contribution, the methodological contribution, and the theoretical contribution. And that really varies from project to project how much in each contribution that is. And when I first read that, I thought, well, I hadn't even thought about the theoretical contribution, because that's not the point of the project. But yeah, so that's some sort of assumption that sometimes these forms have. But when thinking about it, there were still questions that I could sort of raise in connection to this rich empirical contribution that I could list. So yeah, so that's one thing I can mention.
Okay, yeah, because I have a hypothesis that in math education we have a tradition for applying for a PhD scholarship where the person who will be doing it is making the description and trying to frame it. And then, of course, there is the balance between what you want to do and what you believe will get you the money, etc. But apart from that, we have a strong tradition for having the researcher to come to specify the framing. In other areas of research, we have other conditions. I've heard that people have to do specific details in a larger project, if it's in medicine or in math or in whatever. So I would imagine that it's important for us to maintain this tradition of having the researcher as the key person to frame it, also because many of us, if not by far the majority of us, come from teaching one way or the other. So a relevance perspective in the relation to the relationship between teaching and research would probably affect our way of framing our research. What do you think about that? Yeah, Maria?
Yeah, I think for me it's a difference between being a PhD student and now being a researcher as a teacher education, because as a PhD student I could frame my own PhD and worked deeply into that for 3 years. But now when I'm back at the teacher education, the external funding is very important for the institution, and a way to get the external funding is to go and collaborate with other institutions, for example, the other university colleges and the universities and companies, etc. And when we are doing this huge appliement, then we have to agree on the relevance. So, and when the institution gets the funding, if they do, then we need some researchers who can work into that. And then, oh, Maria, can you? Yes, can you? So how can I design my own research in terms of the columns there are in my situation?
So you feel more restricted now than when you were a PhD student?
I'm back. I've just been back shortly, but I'm a little bit strategic, and so I'm thinking, okay, how can I be a part of the application? How can I, do research that I want to, and not just I'm being a PhD who, okay, you can do that and you can do that.
Okay, Noah, you had a comment?
Yeah, as I said before, I was so fortunate to be able to write and design my own project self. So my I was not. I got allowed to do what I wanted in that way during the project, but while the interpretation of the data. Then I got challenged several times because of, we can say, cultural differences. Like I said, I was working in a research environment with a lot of people doing economics and political science, and their interests were so different. So sometimes when I was focusing on analyzing the results, measure it by, for example, as you wrote in your question, do we care about the quality of mathematics teaching? And what is quality? For me, it was how the students solved the problems, flexible or adaptive. using the number and different ways, while I was always asked to say, what about the accuracy? And there was a bit of conflict sometimes about what is the most important variables to work with. Is it accuracy, or is it, for example, flexibility? And that we had a lot of conversation, I will not call it conflicts, but conversations about that. What is the most important thing to work on here?
Interesting. All right, now we are a little more than halfway through the panel debate, so we'll take just a 5 minutes sort of like digest what's been put up in the air so far and a mini break. So we'll resume the discussion at 2 o'clock. All right? All right. Not surprisingly, we'll now move on to discussing in a similar way, but now initially at least related to trustworthiness. That is the issue of why should we believe what the author says, which I can say I find it interesting when reading it in Schoenfeld's paper, because it is probably one of the most valued claims of research in general. I mean, that it has to be trustworthy. So from a research perspective, that is more often discussed than relevance, I would say. Relevance is more something that we add as math education researcher or education researchers. So again, you can dig in on whether you want to comment on your own research or math education in general, but how do you see this perspective of trying to maintain or increase trustworthiness of your research or research in general? What are your thoughts on that? Anna, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can say, because Jóhann, you had a question before that, do we care? And reading the paper by Schoenfeld that we were asked to do, he said that there's a tension between wanting to do a difference and then the dangers of like reducing problems. You make it, like you want to make a difference, so you make a claim too easily. And at first it just struck me that we're really a group of very many people that really wants to make a difference for math education, and that's kind of cool, I think. But yeah, I have really experienced that it's hard to make a claim and not be too optimistic. yeah.
But how, if we try to be more specific, how would you say that which part of you're an ongoing PhD student,
yeah.
right? What do you do in your research to make it trustworthy?
Yeah, so one very concrete thing is that I used a mixed method. I used both qualitative and quantitative methods, and look from different parts. But and I feel like this trustworthiness, that is what you usually put your mind to when you start as a PhD student. As you say, that's like the foundation of being a researcher. But the thing that also struck me is how subjective some things can be when you, as Schoenfeld also says, that what you tend to, but also how you write. Like writing is so, how I phrase my sentence, what I emphasize will make the message in very different ways. So that's really something to handle, and I think something that comes down to my conscience, like being true to the data.
And has, like we talked about with the issue of relevance, has the trustworthiness in your research, has that been affected by the fact that you wanted it to be relevant, or that you wanted it to be close to teaching practice? As you've mentioned, you wanted your research to also influence the practice of teaching? I mean, have you felt any dilemmas or, yeah? Yeah,
very, very much. Also in the collaboration with teachers, I try to be like, think of all the issues that can come up in the collaboration and have like everything under control. But then when you go into the classroom, there are so many things that you don't can foresee, and you just have to, we'll manage with what we have and try to be truthful. Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I would like to add to that, because I also collaborate a lot with the teachers during a whole year, and because of my background as a teacher, I thought that would be easy, and we are two of the same kind, and I have relation to them. But then when I did the observation and I saw that the thing we have agreed on should happen, it didn't happen or something else happened, then I came in a conflict with myself as a teacher personality, with my researcher personality, if you can say it like that. So I spent a lot of time of accepting, or how can I use this conflict in a progressive way in my research, and also about how do I see and talk and collaborate with the teachers, because the truthworthiness also come in the beginning, because if the school leader didn't trusted me when I wrote her a mail, if they want to contribute to this research, she has just put the mail aside, but I knew her from previous, so that's my way into this school and to these teachers, and I was the whole time aware of that if I lost the teachers' confidence and so on, then they will just stop collaboration with me. So when I saw I was feeling this conflict between the researcher and my teaching personality, then I was always like, okay, how much can I ask the teachers what happened? Because what if they say, oh no, we're not interested in working with you? So I spent a lot of time of this collaboration thing, and it went well, but I've learned a lot of that. So next time I take that into account, that I have these issues.
And would you say, when you say that you compare your research personality with your teacher background personality, and sometimes there's causes a conflict, does that mean that you think that from the perspective of trustworthiness, that's something that belongs to your research personality? I mean, or to us, that trustworthiness is something researchers care about? Whereas, I mean, the 3 teachers you cooperated with, I would imagine they didn't care much about whether your cooperation was trustworthy in a broader sense, or?
Yeah, I think the trustworthiness can be in several levels, as you say. So we have one level with the academic community. We have to be trustworthy, and how should we believe what we write? But of course, we also have it for the practitioners. So now when I have a workshop, or I come and tell about my research to practitioners, teachers, I have to be trustworthy in their context. And for example, now we talk a lot about reading articles, but we are very aware of that we could also do other kinds of telling about, like doing podcasts and writing articles for other journals, and not necessarily academic journals.
I think that's an important awareness, just like that we identified at least 2 different perspectives on relevance. Now we have also at least 2 different perspectives on trustworthiness. I mean, trustworthiness in the traditional research sense, can we get our things published because the reviewers and editors believe that it is trustworthy? That's often an issue when you have a review process. And the other, which is less obvious, I think, from a general research perspective, is this trustworthiness among peers or among people who want to apply the research. For instance, teachers, and that's, I believe, a special thing when you work with application-oriented sciences like math education. I would imagine that a math or a physics researcher wouldn't have the same distinction. Yeah?
I'll add to that as well. And I think it's interesting, because I think in being in a larger video study, we have a sort of very high regard for being very trustworthy and having a rigorous sort of way of studying the videos. Also because we want to sort of represent the truth that's been observed in a good way, so we don't sort of misrepresent the classrooms we have observed, of course, as we have been allowed into so many classrooms as well. But I think sort of the tension might be that making claims while being trustworthy about the research also may lower the relevance to many sort of the teachers, because I know that many of my teacher students often ask for, well, how should I do it well then? How should I enact goals in a good way? They want sort of a recipe to do it, right? And I wouldn't want to use my research to say that, well, you can do these 3 things and then your teaching will be great, right? Which, it's a tension. So if you want to do a trustworthy research, might lower the relevance to some practitioners and in the practice field, I think.
Laura?
Yeah, I think here in my experience it was very, very different who were you talking to. When I was doing seminars back where I were doing my PhD in the group of PhD students or professors at the university, the old question was originally about the size of the data set statistically, because I was doing a quantitative research, developing a test, but that also had a qualitative element because I have to code the items and the students' strategies. But at the seminars with other PhD students within economics and doing similar research, they were all asking about if the control variables, have I control for socioeconomic status, for classes, for sizes, item difficulties, continuously about different control variables. When I met then my colleagues at the teacher education or similar colleagues like here, everybody asked about the conceptual framework, how the definitions, the coding process, how am I going to code this different strategy, what is flexibility and how to code adaptivity. So totally different questions, different worries about my trustworthiness. And then the third group, the teachers that I meet now, for example, at workshops, like you mentioned, they have the third type of questions. They, of course, ask about the data all the time. Isn't recent enough? Is it a recent data? Is it old data? Everything must have changed since then. Everything is so there are totally different questions from the three groups, although the one similarity is that the statistics and the teacher agree about the number of classes are very, very important.
Jóhann?
Yeah, I have just a very concrete example of where I sort of faced this during my PhD. So the second paper that I wrote I was trying to sort of set out to compare the observation evidence and a student perception survey. So when it came to cognitive activation, where the students' perceptions that the teachers were asking them to explain their thinking and so forth. And what I wanted to do in the paper was to provide some illustrations of these sort of three groups of lessons that I had according to the observation evidence. But it was with all the sort of excerpts from the teacher-student interactions and everything from those three groups, it was impossible to do that in less than 1,000 words, say. And that just bloated the word count so much that the practicality of word count for the journal just didn't allow for it. So that was something I found important for the trustworthiness, that the readers would really understand what I meant. But I had to sort of compromise for that and only have that sort of clearly laid out in my dissertation, but not in the journal article.
And just to follow up on that, did you feel any of the weighing off that you mentioned, Alexander, between relevance and, I mean, in that specific case, did you have to lower, in your own opinion, the relevance of what you were writing at the expense of sort of like committing to those requirements of trustworthiness?
In a way, yes, because the data is such qualitative data. I mean, you have just words and images, right? And you're trying to sort of quantify and categorize them in some way. And that paper was by far the most quantitative one among my papers. So yes, I mean, I would hardly pick that. Like that would be the last on my list if I were to pick one of my PhD papers for teacher students to read. I would much rather choose my dissertation and have them read that to get the sort of the context of the lessons and all of that. Yeah, for sure.
And we also, during lunch, we also talked about this issue of, and you mentioned it with your two perspectives on trustworthiness, Maria, that we know, all of us, I think, that what is considered relevant for teacher students, for instance, or for teachers that you cooperate with is very different from what is considered relevant and trustworthy from peer researchers. So I would imagine that the more we can end up in a situation where the more we strive for very rigorous trustworthiness in the research publications, the less relevant they are seen from a user's perspective, and therefore we would often have to publish things twice, which you mentioned that some of you do. One version for your teacher students and one version for your peer colleagues. Maybe that is reflected in the weighing of these different dimensions. Okay, let's bring in the third dimension so that we also have a little time for that. Generality. That's in Schoenfeld's framing, that has to do with the question of for whom is this research relevant? And again, to stress it, he states, of course, that it's not research if it's only relevant for the persons who did it. I mean, it has to be relevant for someone else. Otherwise, we're not providing knowledge that goes beyond what we find interesting ourselves. So what are your initial thoughts about generality? For instance, you might think of it with respect to your own PhD projects. What's the generality level of your work? I mean, is it relevant for a lot of people? Is it only relevant for a few? Is it relevant for less than you hoped it to be? Stuff like that, yeah? Anna?
Well, I think it's easy to this kind of question really raises the topic of like effect size and like measure, but I think it kind of reduces the power of humanity and like the science of humanities, because I think my research is made on students at their first year in vocational education on it's just like a few lessons, so it's very specific. But then I think that everyone passes this idea where they have to generalize their equation solving knowledge, maybe not in that year, but it could apply to other students. But also it highlights ideas of how students learn numbers as like a separate part of like, oh, now we take like the decimal form, and now we take negative numbers. So it also highlights other issues, and it's really hard to measure the effect size. So far it's at least 3 teachers, but I'm hoping for more, yeah.
But wouldn't you imagine that for some people the effect size would be a measure for generality or their feeling of your research being relevant? But I could also imagine someone else, like the participants or someone who wouldn't care about your effect size.
Yeah. I'm not sure I follow.
Well, it's just that effect size is a measure.
Yeah.
Right, for who is it affecting, but it can be generally applicable or relevant without having a high effect size. I mean, there are other ways to raise the generality. That's just the issue, because that's the technical approach in a way.
Yeah.
So have you had other thoughts about how your research can be made generally relevant for people apart from effect size, simply just by, I mean, coming back to your point, Maria, the way you convey it, or the way you communicate it, or the way you cooperate with people, or relational generality in a way.
Yeah, and I really want to like take different approaches to that, both like collaborations. I also hope that like it can be made relevant in future publications. Maybe someone hears of my research and picks it up, and like it can be a part of. So I hope there are many ways that it can be applied in the general. But so far it's like more hypothesis. The only thing I examine are these teachers. So it's hard to make the claim. And
you're 1 year, I believe, into your PhD project, right? So you're not in the I can look back at my project phase yet completely.
Partly like a little past the middle. Yeah.
Okay, Jóhann.
Yeah, so revisiting this tax balance Schoenfeld that we're sort of building this discussion on, when talking about generality, he introduces this concept of existence proof that I also mentioned here earlier in my introduction. And I think that sort of resonated with me concerning my study, since one of the arguments I make is that it does provide an existence proof that there are lessons with high cognitive activation that do exist in the Icelandic and Nordic context. And this is what they look like, and sort of a description of them. And they're quite different from these typical norms and patterns of teaching that is described in multiple previous studies in the Nordic countries. And sort of given the evidence from other contexts of educational benefits of those teaching practices for students receiving instruction, high cognitive activation, it sort of suggests pathways to develop teaching in Iceland and the Nordic countries. But still, on the topic of generality, it's in the context of Iceland, the data from there was collected in 2019. That's pre-pandemic and pre-other world events that impacted the Icelandic society. So I would hardly claim that its replicability is high or I mean, maybe possible to repeat the same sort of process of gathering information about sort of general trends over time or something like that. But again, there will be severe limitations to generality, I would say.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, one of my contribution to the practice and academic world, or mostly practice and municipalities, is that STEM education could be maybe we have in the schools, they have 3 times a year, a week or 2. They have this, for example, they focus on handling big amount of data. That could be one way to go into the ambition STEM competence for all students. And so, of course, I would like that the politicians, they write that in the fælles mål or in the curriculum. But one way to start is, from my own point of view, I'm teaching student teachers. So maybe I could start with my own teaching and trying to have weeks where STEM competence is the main focus.
To make it general towards them in a way.
To let the math students see that, okay, even though I don't know anything about solar panels, maybe I could work with mathematical modeling in that. Or
Yeah, I'll sort of add to Jóhann, since we've been in the same project, I guess. I also encountered this problem with generality because I use data from 3 different educational contexts, which are, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. And Swedish-speaking Finland I'll add as a even more so specific case. But I believe it's hard to. I want to claim there's some sort of generality to the things I've described, but it's hard to say something about it if you want to do it in the right way, and that's due to the trustworthiness, of course. But I believe maybe using the rich descriptions, which Jóhann also sort of described, is one way of also showing sort of the relevance in some way, but also perhaps describing enough for people to see some inkling of beginning of generalization eventually, or theoretical generalization.
Okay. There's a little time left, so I'll go back to looking at the 3 dimensions together. Because when I do math education research, one of my concerns is that I often feel that there's a weighing off between them, and that I have to take a stance and I have to make a decision. And sometimes the way that I would like to weigh them off is not the same as the way my reviewers of my paper or the editor or whatever would make the weighing. And then we have a disagreement in the field. Have you experienced, when you look back at your research PhD projects, have you experienced that you have had to weigh off between some of them, that in order, for instance, to ensure trustworthiness, you would have to do something that you knew would lower the relevance, for instance? Or have you had any such experiences in your work? Jóhann, you're nodding.
Yeah, I mean, it's just similar to what I just described. Since the way that we sort of use the camera lens in this context is sort of like as a window into the classroom. Like you can take a completely different stance and look at the lens as a mirror, and have perhaps the teachers looking at their own recordings of their teaching, or teacher-student looking at another teacher and sort of reflecting on what they would do in this situation. But then you're doing this trade-off that you're describing, because you're always so I believe there's always a trade-off here in these three dimensions, and I can hardly imagine a study that would.
But why do you think there is this trade-off? Because one could hope and imagine that it should be possible to have be very strong on trustworthiness and also make it relevant. What is it that causes the necessary weighing off, from your opinion? Why does it have to be like that?
It's just a reality we live with, right? I mean, there are like I encountered this limitation of the word count. Just these practicalities sometimes just get in the way of being able to achieve like that level in all cases. So.
So it's part of sort of like you mentioned culture, Maria. It's part of the culture of doing research, maybe that reinforces what we do as educational researchers, of course.
Yeah, you could say that. Yeah. Well.
Alexander, you mentioned earlier in one of your previous comments that you had a weighing off between trustworthiness and relevance when we had those two up. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. No, I think sort of the big thing for me is it's very important for me to present my data in a way that it's as rigorous as possible, being in the form of data that it is, being video studies, and you want to represent the teachers in a as descriptive way as possible. Then again, the results will be thereafter. You can only say so much out from video data without doing sort of an achievement check or something like that. So you have to limit what you can say about it. And I think the relevance will be perhaps higher to researchers if you do it in the trustworthy way. But then again, to practitioners and teachers and politicians, perhaps, if you're setting policy, it might not be as useful. You can't say anything very direct and say that, well, this is the way to do that. So you should do it like this, but very rarely do you have the data to say that, I think. Or at least I haven't yet had that.
Do you think, would it be fair to say that if we relate the weighing off between these dimensions with the issue of the relationship between research as an activity and teaching practice as an activity, that what is considered most important is very different from a research perspective than from a teaching practice perspective, so that that's just a not very positive hypothesis, that maybe we are systematically installing very different weighings of these dimensions when we act as researchers, because we try to act as researchers do most, and research tends to favor some of them, like we talked about, at the expense of others. Researchers often don't care traditionally that much about relevance seen from like in our case, the teacher's perspective. It's not, as I have experienced, it's not part of, can you publish this stuff, that have you tried it with teachers and do they believe that what you're doing is relevant for them? That's not a question being asked. But trustworthiness is very much a question being asked, right? Have you any experiences with that, or do you agree to that picture of the different, like you phrased it, Maria, the different positions or personalities, or because you're all people who want to influence teaching practices one way or the other, right? You come from there, but now you work as a researcher or have worked. So there must be a challenge there, or I feel there is a challenge. Maybe you feel it too. Yeah.
Yeah, I think often yes, and I think it goes back to the statements I made as well. I think that in order to sort of, if you're going to reach all groups, then you need to find ways of presenting data in a way that's relevant, not just a presentation for teachers, because I think that will be very one-way street again, and then we're back to square zero. But you need to find ways of collaborating with teachers then to sort of have them reach more sort of relevance for both. I'm certain there are ways of doing it that will sort of increase both at least, but in many cases I think there will be a sort of a trade-off. Yeah.
Have anyone else of you have had sort of like experiences of trading off between them, or when you submit a paper, or when you do your PhD study, or? No? Yeah.
I don't think I have experienced that. It's all about making choices. You have to make a method. How to spend that
method choice, yeah.
Choices, and that have always their strength and limitations, and you are aware of that. So I don't think I have experienced it's how you frame it, but I have experienced making choices, of course.
Yeah, but maybe if I should follow your line that it has a lot to do with methodological choices, maybe we would tend to make methodological choices like going quantitative even when it's not necessary, or whatever. Making methodological choices because we know that at the end of the day, our PhD project or our paper or whatever will be assessed, not least along the dimension of trustworthiness. So we need to ensure that in our methodological choice, and then we accept if we lower the dimension of relevance, that's just the way it is. But maybe that's causing the gap between practice and research.
And again, that's a question of relevance for whom? Is it for me or for different kind of public?
But if we say relevance for the teaching practice, to stay with that relation.
And that can be seen in different layers, because, for example, I made my choice to make this quantitative testing a lot of children. I had 2,300 children involved, 121 classes. So I was traveling around and testing the different children. And of course, that was a choice, but that was because I needed to get the broad picture before making the next step in my research career. And now I'm going to do, starting this year, with an intervention based on the results from my PhD, so the next step will be a different choice.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting to hear your thoughts on all these issues. I know there is a box of chocolate like we've had for the other presenters, so let's hand them out. There you go. Oh, and there was one from you too, Thomas. Thank you very much. So that's as far as we got. Let's once again give them an applause for being so brave to share their thinking. Thank you.